Hey guys, it was requested by some students in first hour that I just make a video that continues our look at the short answer prompt. And so here I am. All right, so we left off looking at, question one, or part A of the short answer, right? And so this one was identifying and explaining major differences. Now, the key is in trade and in economic systems. So I look at trade and I think like luxury versus bulk. And when I look at economic systems, I'm thinking like, how is exchange being handled? And so that's where we came up with barter versus credit or currency, right? So in places like Africa, we got barter versus, currency on the Silk Road or in China. And then I also thought, economic systems and trade, type of trade, we could look at maritime, which means shipping, versus overland trade, like the Trans-Saharan and the Silk Roads. Right. So that's what we did. And so then I just picked for my example, specifically looking at credit versus barter. So if the question is what's the difference, the difference is, right? So one major difference in trade was method of payment. Notice how I keep that broad. I don't want to be too specific. I don't want to say the difference was barter or the difference was money. That's getting too specific. I just want to talk about how we're exchanging items. That's the loose topic. Then my evidence is where I can really dig into the heart of it, right? So barter, that's an example. That's evidence. So barter is one style, and that is different than credit or currency. Well, I got to prove it, and this is where evidence comes in. Now I need specific facts. So my specific facts had been barter existed in Africa, and proof of that was the famous gold salt trade. And if I really want to get even deeper than that, what I would say is like, we got gold salt, but gold is West Africa, places like Mali. I'm getting parentheses and parentheses, guys. This is like deep. This is algebra, bro. Algebra. Salt is from North Africa. Okay, and so we notice that those two systems connect. This product, trade. Okay, that is dissimilar from cash, currency, credit, however you want to bundle it, being used in, for example, the Silk Road or China. And so we said flying cash. Now be careful. You want to give definitions as evidence. A definition is not analysis. So flying cash, which is a credit system in which you can deposit goods at a creditor and receive points or money for those items, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Or they had currency. They used copper coins. They used paper money, and then go crazy, right? The Mongol continued to use paper money, blah, 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 blah. Under analysis, that's where we got to talk about so the hell what? Who cares, right? What's the point? And the point is currency allowed the Chinese to have broad participation. People from the Middle East, India, Europe, anyone could come to a central spot like China and then deposit their products and then earn these credits, these trade points. That wasn't true in Africa where barter then meant that you had to have either salt or gold. It really limited who could participate in that trade. And so we noticed the volume much smaller when there's barter. Doesn't mean that it's not valuable, but fewer people have access. The Silk Road relied on volume of trade, not size of trade. There's my analysis. That's how they're different. All right, so let's pick up with B. B is a new one then. So B, we're identifying and explaining one trend. Okay, so trends. So what are some similarities when we look at the chart? What are some trends? Well, I think there's a bunch. One trend could be luxury, because we notice luxury in the Silk Road and we notice luxury in Sahara. A trend could be overland, Silk Road and Sahara. A trend could be that all of these systems relied on technology or innovations to make trade safer or more likely to be conducted. That could be a trend. I think another trend would definitely be the fact that we have cultural diffusion or the spreading of religions and cultural customs along the trade routes. I think all of those really seem to be a trend. So then notice it says, in cultural interaction and diffusion. Well, I think there we see then a trend would be spreading of religion along the trade networks. That's where I would go. Right, personally, I think that's where there's the most opportunity to talk about stuff, is how religion is spreading along the trade networks. Okay, so let's highlight that with blue. Okay, so I think that's my idea. So what was the trend? The trend was a common trend of early modern trade was the spreading of religions to new areas. Okay. Now we got to prove that. We got to give some examples of that actually happening, and then we got to talk about why and so what. Okay, I'm going to stop here because I have homeroom and it's got to start right now. So I'm going to stop and then I'm going to splice this with another bad boy. I will see you guys soon. All right, so we're back. We're in the middle of part B of the short answer. And remember, you're going to be answering all three of these. And we left off by talking about cultural interactions and trends of those cultural interactions. And we selected the idea that a common, that should be trade, a common trend of early modern trade was the spreading of religions to new areas. So evidence, right? We got to think about where in the world were we seeing religions spread? What religions are most famous for spreading down these trade routes? And so we actually have a bunch of examples that we can choose from. Now, I'm going to caution you here. So, like, Buddhism would be a good one. We mentioned the fact that Buddhism was like one of the early Silk Road religions. But if we're in the 1200 to 1450 time period, Buddhism doesn't fit as nicely there because that's already kind of been done by this point. So be careful that, like, even though it's good info, we don't actually go outside of the time period. So as nice as Buddhism is, I'm going to like back out of that. And I'm going to really focus on Islam. Now, you got to say more than like, well, Islam spread. When did it spread? How did it spread? Where was it spreading? Right? We've got to be more specific. So I could talk about things like the Umayyad dynasty spread Islam. Oh, but they really did it more by the sword. So they spread Islam by military, which doesn't really help us, right? Because we're trying to talk about trade. It was later groups like the Abbasid dynasty, right? So we could talk about this idea that they really were the ones who opened up trade down the Silk Road in Dar al-Islam. We could talk about the amount of Muslim merchants that expanded into North Africa. And eventually, and that was like with the rise of Dar al-Islam, right? So that's still in the same time period. But then because of things like the trans-Saharan trade, Islam makes it to West Africa, right? And there we could talk about people like Mansa Musa converting. And why did he convert? Because it allowed for better business deals. It allowed for people to recognize his power. He kind of had like a natural acceptance as a king now because of his Muslim nature. So like that could work. The same is true with East Africa, right? Islam will spread down the East African shores because of Indian Ocean trade. Right, so Islam joins West Africa to those Swahili coastal cities as part of the trade system. Right, India is probably our best example here, right? And we talk about India and all those port cities, and they had so much Islamic influence, right, that they had little small Islamic communities. They mentioned that there's this thing called diasporic communities, and that means that they're like people away from their homeland. So partially because of the monsoons, right? These Muslims would be stuck there, and so eventually they start to integrate into Indian life, right? That's just this kind of like common. We could talk about China. I mean, there's so much we could say. Right? We could talk about China and Guangzhou. Remember, we read that reading about like a Muslim cemetery and Muslim mosques and blah, blah, blah. So there's an abundance. So then the analysis is, why do we see that trend? And then, so what about it? So why was there that trend? Well, we could talk about Dar al-Islam brought the faith to many places that eventually would be connected through trade routes. Eventually would connect by a trade. So it's not surprising, right, that if Islam moves into the Middle East or moves to North Africa, and North Africa has trade connections, well, then it will continue to transfer or diffuse down those trade systems. So that could work. We could talk about the benefits here. So the so what, we could also talk about in like this trend, right? The trend was also a trend in, better business. It was in their best interest to become Islamic. Better business deals, smaller fees, that kind of stuff. It led to recognition by other leaders and merchants. So, if you're just some tribe in the middle of West Africa, I don't really know you. But if I show up to town and I know that you're a practicing Muslim and that you have certain beliefs, and now I trust you. Now we have common ground. We might have similar language connections, right? Because we're reading the Bible in Arabic. I mean, not the Bible, the Quran in Arabic. And so that leads to, a greater confidence. All right, last one. So this doesn't go on too long. Topic C, we're looking at identify and explain one way that merchants overcame an environmental barrier to trade. So there's two parts to this one. Even though it's only 1 point, right, you have no choice, but you have to establish what the barrier is and then how you solve that. So if I'm thinking like something like a barrier to trade might be, the climate, or difficult land features, or long distances. That's a nice generic answer, right? So that would be a good topic. All right, then my solution to that thing as my evidence, well, it depends on what you pick. So if we're talking about hot arid climates in the Sahara, and they're so hot that people die out there, there's not a lot of water, so most people don't have the means to travel. You could also talk about sandstorms being very common. You could talk about the dangers of being cut off, from other civilizations. Like you don't have the ability to get fresh supplies. Well, what's the solution? Camels. And then camels alone weren't enough, so they had special saddles, camel saddles. They had camel caravans. Eventually, when there's camel caravans, they developed oases or caravanserai, where those camel caravans would stop. And eventually what that means is the camel allowed people to penetrate through the barrier of this hot, arid desert, because camels could, hold water. They could protect you from sandstorms. And so the hardiness of the animal, plus the saddle being able to carry a lot of weight, meant that merchants could not only survive, but could also make a lot of money, carrying a ton of salt, or salt and some silks, or whatever else. And so that would fit into your analysis then. How do you prove that you're right? Well, this technology that I mentioned here as my evidence, well, it does X, Y, and Z. And that's useful because blah, blah, blah. That's where you argue it out. So guys, remember, at the end of this, you really want to make sure that your sample on your test on Monday looks like this, right? You really want to have something robust, a topic sentence, several sentences that really develop evidence. And the goal for your evidence isn't to pick every damn thing. It's to pick from those things the best evidence. So in this pre-writing phase, think of 5 pieces of evidence. Think of 10 pieces of evidence. But don't write them all. Then pick what are my best 3? What are my best 2 pieces? And start to narrow that evidence down so it really fits the argument you're making. And then that's where your analysis becomes easier. I've got this fact, and that's key because, and I got this fact, and that helped because. It all of a sudden helps tighten up the topic, because you don't have evidence that's kind of crappy connected. It all fits nice and together. All right, so hopefully that helps. Again, guys, as always, please email, hit me up on Hangouts. Let me know if I can help you out. Monday is a massive day. All right, guys. Stay strong.